Two tiny puppies were found curled together on a frozen porch, their bodies stiff with cold, their breath barely visible in the winter air. Someone had left them there to disappear. No footprints, no note, no second thought. Inside the cabin, a man stood watching through the snow, a man who had survived fire, loss, and years of silence. He believed his life no longer had room for saving anything. But that night, as the storm pressed in and the cold closed its grip, those two forgotten lives would change him forever. What happens next will make you believe in quiet miracles and second chances for the forgotten. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your country in the comments below. And if you believe no child or animal should ever face fear alone, hit subscribe now and share this story with someone who needs hope. Winter in Missoula, Montana, did not announce itself loudly. It arrived with patience and stayed with certainty. Snow fell steadily across the city and its outskirts, settling into streets, forests, and riverbanks, as if the land had always been meant to live beneath it. The Clark Fork River slowed under a thin skin of ice, releasing faint clouds of mist that drifted low over the water before dissolving into the gray air. Beyond the last paved road, where the town thinned into wilderness, winter became less forgiving. Out there, the cold was not scenery, it was law. Caleb Rowe lived where the city ended. His cabin stood alone among tall lodgepole pines, its cedar walls weathered by years of snow and sun. The roof sagged slightly under the season's weight, and the narrow porch bore scars from ice and time. It was not a place built to impress or invite. It was built to endure. Caleb preferred it that way. Inside, the stone hearth held a small, steady fire. Its glow filled the cabin, with a muted warmth that softened the sharp edges of the cold. Caleb stood near it, rubbing his hands together, coaxing life back into fingers stiffened by the morning air. At 41, he moved with economy and restraint, the kind shaped by years of physical labor and risk. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and solid without excess. His dark hair was cropped short, streaked with early gray that caught the firelight when he turned his head. A neatly trimmed beard outlined a face defined by sharp angles and control. His eyes, a subdued hazel, were observant and steady. They were eyes accustomed to watching conditions shift and reacting before disaster arrived. Before retreating to Missoula's outskirts, Caleb had been a smoke jumper. He was one of the men dropped from planes into burning wilderness, while others evacuated. Fire had taught him discipline, awareness, and consequence. It had also taught him loss. Years earlier, a sudden change in wind direction trapped his crew deep in a canyon. Caleb survived because he had paused to secure equipment while the others moved ahead. The fire moved faster than anyone expected. The space that saved him became a distance he carried ever since. He told people he came to Montana for quiet. That was true, but incomplete. What he needed was space wide enough for memory to loosen its grip. Caleb reached for his heavy wool coat, the cuff frayed from years of use, and pulled it on. He slipped into his boots and opened the cabin door to retrieve firewood from the stack outside. The hinges creaked softly as cold air rushed in, wrapping around him with familiar indifference. He took a slow breath. The air burned clean through his lungs, sharp and bracing. Then he stopped. Two small shapes lay on the porch floorboards, nearly buried beneath a thin layer of snow. At first glance, they did not register as living. They were too still, too quiet, their outlines blurred by frost and shadow. For a moment, Caleb's mind resisted what his eyes were seeing. One of the shapes trembled. The movement was slight, almost imperceptible, but it was enough. Caleb crouched instinctively, his boots crunching against ice. The shapes resolved into two puppies, pressed tightly together as if bound by necessity. Border collies, no more than 6 or 7 weeks old. Their black and white fur was stiff with ice, clumped where melting snow had refrozen. Their paws were tucked beneath their bodies, useless against the cold. Their breathing was shallow and uneven. The larger puppy lifted its head weakly at the sound of the door opening. A thin cloud of breath escaped its mouth and vanished almost immediately into the gray air. The smaller one barely moved. Caleb scanned the clearing beyond the porch. Snow stretched unbroken in every direction. There were no footprints, no tire marks, no sign of recent movement. Whoever had brought the puppies here had done so before the storm, early enough for the snowfall to erase all evidence. The intention was unmistakable. Leave them somewhere remote. Let the weather finish the task. Caleb felt his heart rate quicken, not with fear, but with recognition. The same sharp awareness he had felt in emergencies when hesitation meant loss. He removed one glove and extended his bare hand slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and calm. The cold bit into his skin, but he did not pull back. "Hey," he said quietly. His voice was low and steady, the same tone he once used to keep men focused when panic threatened to undo them. "It's all right." The larger puppy shifted, placing its body protectively over the smaller one. Its dark eyes followed Caleb's hand with wary intelligence. It made a faint sound, not quite a growl, not quite a whine. "I know," Caleb murmured. "Easy." He slid his hands beneath them carefully. They weighed almost nothing. The smaller puppy sagged against his palm, its body frighteningly light. The larger one tensed, but did not resist. From down the narrow dirt road came the sound of measured footsteps and a familiar voice. "You planning on freezing out there, Ro?" Caleb turned his head. Evelyn Parker stood several yards away, wrapped in a long gray coat that bore the marks of many winters. She was 72, tall for her age, with a posture that remained upright despite time's quiet demands. Wisps of silver hair escaped from beneath her knitted hat, framing a face lined with years, but softened by attentiveness. Her pale blue eyes were alert and discerning, shaped by a lifetime of observation rather than judgment. Evelyn had spent decades as a librarian in Missoula before retiring. Widowed young, she had learned to live independently without bitterness. People trusted her without quite knowing why. She followed Caleb's gaze and saw the puppies. Her expression changed immediately. "Oh," she said softly, "they're just babies." "Someone left them here," Caleb replied. Evelyn stepped closer, careful on the ice. "This winter hasn't spared much," she said. "Even grown animals struggle in it." Caleb nodded. He adjusted his grip, shielding the puppies from the wind as he stood. Their faint warmth pressed against his chest, fragile but real. Something shifted inside him, subtle but undeniable. Evelyn watched him for a long moment, then spoke gently. "Looks like they found the right porch." Caleb did not respond. He turned toward the open door, carrying the puppies inside. Warm light spilled out across the snow, briefly illuminating the frozen clearing before the door closed behind him. The forest remained silent. Winter held its ground. Inside the cabin, warmth reclaimed the air, and two small lives were no longer alone. For the first time in years, neither was Caleb Rowe. The cabin warmed slowly, the way old places always did. Heat gathered first near the stone hearth, then crept outward along the plank floor, loosening the stiffness from the air. Caleb set the puppies down on a folded wool blanket, a careful distance from the fire, close enough to feel its breath, but far enough to avoid harm. He moved with deliberate restraint, the habits of emergency work guiding his hands even now. Sudden warmth could be as dangerous as the cold they had escaped. The larger puppy lifted its head almost immediately. Its eyes, dark and watchful, tracked Caleb as he reached for a clean towel and a metal bowl. The smaller one remained still, its breathing shallow and uneven, the faint rise and fall of its ribs barely visible beneath its frost-matted fur. Caleb knelt beside them, assessing without panic. Pale gums, cold paws, weak response. He had seen this before, not in animals, but in people pulled from snow or smoke. The principles were the same. "Slow," he muttered to himself. "Easy." He dampened the towel with lukewarm water and began wiping the ice from their ears and paws, careful not to rub too hard. The larger puppy flinched, then stilled, tolerating the contact with surprising composure. The smaller one twitched faintly, a sign that life had not retreated completely. Caleb exhaled, a breath he had not realized he was holding. Evelyn Parker stood a few steps back, her coat still on, hands folded at her waist. In the firelight, the lines on her face softened, revealing a quiet attentiveness that came from years of watching others more than speaking herself. She did not hover or interfere, she simply stayed present. "You've done this before," she said. Caleb nodded without looking up. "Enough times." He wrapped the smaller puppy in the towel and lifted it gently, holding it against his chest beneath his coat. The animal was light, alarmingly so, but the faint warmth of its body pressed back against him, fragile and persistent. He could feel its heartbeat, uneven but present, fluttering against his ribs. Evelyn crossed the room and placed a kettle on the stove, filling it from a pitcher. "I'll make something warm," she said. "For you, at least. They'll need time." Caleb glanced at her briefly. "Thank you." As the kettle began to hiss, the larger puppy struggled to its feet, legs unsteady, and wobbled closer to its sibling. It let out a small sound, impatient, insistent, and pressed its head against the towel-wrapped bundle in Caleb's arms. The gesture was clumsy, but unmistakably protective. Caleb allowed himself a faint, surprised smile. "You're stubborn," he said quietly. "That's good." Evelyn returned with a mug of tea and set it within reach. "Stubborn things survive winters," she replied. The hours passed with measured quiet. Outside, the forest remained still, the storm's aftermath pressing against the cabin walls like a held breath. Inside, the Puppies' shivering slowed. The larger one settled beside its sibling, chin resting against the towel, eyes half-lidded but alert. The smaller one's breathing steadied, shallow but no longer erratic. Caleb sat on the floor, back against the wall, one arm resting protectively near the blanket. The fire cracked softly. Shadows moved along the walls, tracing familiar outlines of tools, shelves, and the map of western Montana pinned near the door. He watched the puppies and found his thoughts drifting, not to the fire line or the canyon, but to quieter memories. Early mornings before flights, coffee shared without words. Trust built not through speeches, but through repetition and care. Evelyn watched him from her chair. "You know," she said after a while, "people think the cold kills fast. It doesn't. It waits. It convinces you nothing matters anymore." Caleb nodded. "Fire does the opposite, makes everything matter all at once." She smiled faintly at that. Different teachers, same lesson. Near midnight, the kettle went cold, and the cabin settled into deeper stillness. Caleb adjusted the blanket, then reached for a notebook from the shelf. He hesitated, pen hovering, then set it aside untouched. Not tonight. A soft knock came at the door. Caleb stiffened reflexively, then stood. He opened it to find Jonah Miller on the porch, snow clinging to the shoulders of his canvas jacket. Jonah was in his early 30s, lean and weathered, with a narrow face, wind-reddened skin, and a dark beard that looked perpetually a few days untrimmed. He worked for the county road crew, plowing routes most people forgot existed. Years of long nights and little thanks had shaped him into someone blunt but dependable. "Evelyn's light was on," Jonah said, nodding past Caleb into the cabin. "Thought I'd check." Caleb stepped aside. "You did." Jonah's gaze fell on the puppies. His expression tightened. "Damn," he said softly. "Again?" "Yeah." Jonah removed his gloves, rubbing his hands together. "Road's bad tonight. I almost didn't make it up here." He paused, then added, "They look better than they should." "They're fighting," Caleb said. Jonah nodded once, approval plain. "That counts." He stayed only a few minutes, offering spare blankets from his truck and the quiet assurance that he'd spread word in town by morning. Before leaving, he crouched briefly near the puppies, careful not to startle them. "Hang in there," he murmured, then straightened and pulled his hat low before stepping back into the cold. The night deepened. Evelyn eventually stood, easing into her coat. "They're stable for now," she said. "I'll come by in the morning." Caleb walked her to the door. The moon hung pale above the trees, casting long shadows across the snow. "Thank you for staying," he said. She met his gaze, her eyes steady. "You didn't need to be alone tonight." After she left, the cabin felt quieter, but not empty. Caleb returned to the floor and watched the puppies sleep. The larger one stirred occasionally, adjusting its position to remain in contact with its sibling. The smaller one slept deeply, its body finally relaxing into the warmth. Near dawn, Caleb allowed himself to name them, not aloud, but in the quiet space behind his thoughts. The stronger one, alert and insistent, he thought of as ash, for what endured after fire. The smaller one, fragile but warm, became ember, for what remained alive when everything else faded. When the sky began to lighten at the edges, Caleb rose and added wood to the fire. Outside, the forest exhaled, the worst of the cold loosening its grip. Inside, two small lives slept, no longer abandoned. Caleb stood over them for a long moment, hands resting at his sides, and felt something unfamiliar settle into place. Not obligation, not guilt, purpose. Morning came quietly to the cabin, as if it did not wish to disturb what had survived the dark. Light crept in through the narrow windows, pale and hesitant, reflecting off the snow outside and settling softly across the wooden floor. The fire in the hearth had burned low again, reduced to glowing embers that still held warmth if one leaned close enough. Caleb Rowe was already awake, seated on the floor beside the blanket where the puppies slept, his back against the wall, his legs stretched out stiffly in front of him. He had not slept much, not from worry alone, but from a strange alertness that refused to fade, the kind that came when something fragile depended on you. He watched the puppies breathe, counting each rise and fall without realizing he was doing it. The larger one, Ash, stirred first. His eyes opened slowly, dark and steady, adjusting to the light. He lifted his head, ears still too large for his small skull, and studied the room as if committing it to memory, when he saw Caleb. His tail gave a single, uncertain thump against the blanket. Caleb exhaled. It was a small sound, but it carried relief. Ember slept longer. Her body was still thin, her breathing shallow but steady now. The night had not taken her. That alone felt like a quiet victory. Caleb reached out and brushed 2 fingers lightly along her side. She twitched but did not wake, her warmth more present than it had been hours before. Outside, the forest began to shift. Snow slid from branches with soft thuds. A distant bird called once, testing the morning. Winter had loosened its grip, at least for now. Caleb stood carefully, joints stiff, and added a few pieces of wood to the fire. As the flames caught, warmth spread again through the cabin. Ash struggled to his feet and followed Caleb clumsily, his steps uncoordinated but determined. He sniffed the air, the floor, the chair legs, absorbing the space with serious concentration. Ember woke soon after, lifting her head with effort. She did not attempt to stand. Instead, she watched Ash move, her pale eyes tracking him closely, as if drawing strength from his motion. "You're doing better," Caleb murmured, though he wasn't sure which of them he was speaking to. A knock sounded at the door, firm but unhurried. Caleb turned, instinct briefly flaring, then settled as he recognized the rhythm. He opened the door to find Dr. Hannah Larkin standing on the porch, her boots dusted with snow, a worn leather bag slung over one shoulder. She was in her late 40s, medium height, with a sturdy build, shaped by years of working outdoors. Her dark hair was pulled back into a low ponytail streaked with gray, and her face bore the practical calm of someone accustomed to making decisions under pressure. Her eyes, a deep brown, missed little. Hannah was the nearest veterinarian within 50 miles, serving ranchers, wildlife officers, and the occasional lost pet. Years earlier, she had lost her younger brother in a logging accident, an event that had hardened her resolve without dulling her empathy. People trusted her because she did not promise what she could not deliver. "Evelyn called," she said, stepping inside and glancing immediately toward the blanket. "Said you had 2 in rough shape." Caleb nodded. They made it through the night. Hannah knelt beside the puppies, setting her bag down. She observed first, hands still, letting the animals register her presence. Ash stiffened slightly, but did not retreat. Ember shifted closer to him. "That one's the fighter," Hannah said, nodding toward Ash. "This one's careful." She reached out and checked Ember's gums, then her temperature. "You did the right thing. Slow warming, hydration, no shock." Caleb watched closely. "Will she be all right?" Hannah considered before answering. "She's not out of danger, but she's stronger than she was. That counts." She examined Ash next, listening to his heart, checking his paws. "They're young," she said. "Too young to be out in that cold. Someone knew what they were doing when they left them, or didn't care enough to know." Caleb's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Hannah finished her examination and stood. "They'll need monitoring, soft food once they're ready, and shelter, which you've already provided." She met his gaze directly. "You keeping them for now?" "For now," Caleb replied. Hannah nodded once, satisfied. "I'll stop by again tomorrow. Call if anything changes." She hesitated at the door, then added, "You did good, Caleb. Not everyone would've." After she left, the cabin felt fuller somehow, as if the acknowledgement itself had weight. Later that morning, Caleb loaded the puppies into a padded crate and drove into town. Missoula was stirring as he arrived. Snowplows had cleared the main roads, and the air smelled faintly of exhaust and cold metal. He stopped at the general store near the edge of town, a place that sold everything from feed to coffee. Inside, Mark Delaney stood behind the counter. Mark was in his mid-50s, broad and heavy-set, with a thick mustache and hands scarred from decades of work. He had once planned to leave Montana, but his father's illness and then his own sense of responsibility had kept him rooted. He greeted Caleb with a nod. "Morning," Mark said. His eyes flicked to the crate. "Those the pups I heard about?" "Yeah." Mark leaned forward, peering inside. "Poor things. Folks forget winter doesn't care about intentions." He straightened and reached for a clipboard. "You posting notice?" Caleb nodded. just in case. Mark tacked the handwritten notice to the corkboard near the door. "Word'll spread," he said. "Whether anyone comes forward is another matter." As Caleb paid for supplies, soft food, bedding, supplements, he felt the weight of the decision forming, though he did not name it yet. Back at the cabin, the day settled into a new rhythm. Ash explored more confidently, stumbling less with each pass. Ember drank water from a shallow dish, slowly, carefully. Caleb sat nearby, reading but not really reading, his attention anchored to their movements. By late afternoon, Evelyn returned, carrying a loaf of bread and a small jar of honey. She surveyed the scene with quiet approval. "They look brighter," she said. "They are," Caleb replied. Evelyn set the food down and sat. "Hannah was by my place, said you handled things well." Caleb shrugged. "Did what needed doing." Evelyn studied him. "You always say that, as if what needed doing never costs anything." Caleb did not answer. He watched Ash curl beside Ember, the larger body forming a barrier without being told. As dusk approached, Caleb stood at the window, looking out at the trees darkening against the sky. He felt the weight of choice settle fully now. The puppies would need time, care, commitment, not just through winter, but beyond it. Behind him, the cabin was warm, alive. Caleb turned back to the room and spoke aloud, his voice steady. "You'll stay here, at least until you don't need me anymore." Ash lifted his head. Ember shifted closer. The decision did not feel heavy. It felt inevitable. The days that followed settled into a steady rhythm, the kind that did not demand attention, yet slowly changed everything it touched. Snow still covered the ground around the cabin, but it no longer felt hostile. It creaked underfoot instead of biting, and the air carried the faint promise of thaw beneath its cold surface. Caleb Rowe woke before dawn each morning, as he always had, though now his first instinct was not to check the fire or the weather. It was to listen. Ash and Ember slept in a padded crate near the hearth, their small bodies rising and falling in uneven but improving cadence. Ash woke easily, ears twitching at the slightest sound, his dark eyes sharp even in low light. Ember took longer, stretching carefully before lifting her head, as if testing whether the world was safe enough to engage with. She was still fragile, still thin, but there was more presence in her now, more intention. Caleb knelt beside them and opened the crate. Ash stepped out immediately, tail wagging once, restrained but eager. Ember followed more slowly, placing each paw with consideration. She leaned briefly against Caleb's boot before moving away, a quiet gesture that did not ask for reassurance, but acknowledged it. "Good," Caleb murmured. "You're learning." He took them outside one at a time, careful not to overexert them. The yard behind the cabin was small and uneven, ringed by trees that shielded it from the worst of the wind. Ash sniffed everything with intense focus, circling the perimeter as if mapping territory. Ember stayed closer, watching him, and occasionally glancing back at Caleb, her pale eyes searching his face for cues. Training came naturally to Caleb, though he had not planned it. It was not formal, not yet. Just structure, routine, boundaries that created safety. "Sit, stay, come." Ash responded quickly, his intelligence obvious and his confidence growing with each success. Ember took longer, hesitant but attentive. When she obeyed, she did. So, with deliberation, as if the choice mattered. By mid-morning, Evelyn Parker arrived, her boots crunching softly over snow. She carried a small basket and wore the same long gray coat, though today she had added a scarf the color of pine needles. She paused at the edge of the yard, watching the scene unfold. "They look stronger," she said. "They are," Caleb replied. "Slow, but steady." Evelyn smiled. "That's how most good things happen." She stayed for coffee, sitting at the small table near the window, while Caleb prepared food for the puppies. Ash settled at her feet without being asked, his body relaxed but alert. Ember remained closer to Caleb, lying down only after he sat. "You've changed," Evelyn said after a while, her voice gentle but certain. Caleb glanced up. "How so?" "You're still quiet," she said, "but you're not closed. There's a difference." He considered that, then nodded once. "Maybe." That afternoon, Caleb drove into town, again, this time not for supplies but for conversation. He stopped by the animal aid board near the community center, checking the notice he had posted. No new messages. He felt a brief flicker of something, disappointment or relief, he couldn't tell which. Across the street, a pickup truck idled, its paint dulled by years of work. A man leaned against it, arms crossed, watching Caleb with mild curiosity. He was in his early 60s, tall and angular, with a face weathered by sun and wind. His beard was gray and uneven, trimmed short out of habit rather than care. When Caleb approached, the man straightened. "You the one with the pups?" he asked. "Yeah," the man nodded. "Name's Walter Boone. Used to run cattle north of the river." His voice was rough, worn by years of shouting over engines and open land. "Saw your notice. Thought I'd take a look." Caleb studied him briefly, then gestured toward the truck. Ash and Ember were visible through the crate's slats, watching intently. Walter crouched, careful not to startle them. "Smart-looking dogs," he said. "Border collies, right?" "That's right." Walter's eyes softened. "Had one years back. Best worker I ever owned." He stood slowly, joints stiff. "Lost him to age. Haven't kept animals since." There was something reserved about Walter, a restraint that suggested loss had taught him to measure attachment. He straightened and met Caleb's gaze. "You planning to keep them?" Caleb answered honestly. "I don't know yet." Walter nodded, accepting the answer without pressing. "Fair enough." He glanced back at the dogs. "They're lucky. Winter doesn't forgive mistakes." When Caleb returned to the cabin, the sky had begun to darken again. Clouds gathered low, heavy with the suggestion of more snow. He let the puppies out and watched them move across the yard. Ash chased a falling leaf with sudden enthusiasm, skidding slightly before regaining his footing. Ember followed at a slower pace, stopping halfway to sniff the air, then trotting back to Caleb as if to report. That evening, as the fire crackled and the cabin settled, Caleb sat at the table and opened his notebook. This time, he wrote, Day 7, both eating, Ash strong, Ember cautious but improving. Training helps them, helps me. He paused, then added another line. I don't dread the quiet as much. The wind rose outside, brushing against the cabin walls, but it did not feel threatening. It felt present. Later, as Caleb prepared to turn in, he heard movement near the tree line. A soft wicker carried through the air, unexpected but familiar. He stepped onto the porch and saw a horse standing just beyond the yard, its breath rising in white plumes. The animal was chestnut-colored, tall and lean, with a calm posture that suggested experience rather than youth. A halter hung loosely around its neck. Moments later, Walter Boone emerged from the trees, leading the horse with practiced ease. Sorry, he called softly. Fence line's acting up again. She wanders when she gets bored. Caleb nodded. No trouble. Walter patted the horse's neck. This is Maggie. She's older than she looks. Steadier than most people I know. He glanced toward the cabin, then at the puppies peering through the doorway. You're building something here, he said, not unkindly. Just make sure it's something you're willing to keep. With that, he led the horse back into the dark, his silhouette fading among the trees. Caleb stood on the porch a long moment after, listening to the forest settle again. Inside, Ash and Ember curled together near the fire, their bodies touching without effort. He closed the door quietly and sat beside them. The days ahead were still uncertain. Winter had not released its hold entirely, and choices waited just beyond the present moment. But for now, the shape of those days felt clearer. Caleb reached out and rested a hand, lightly against the warmth of two small lives, and allowed himself to believe that this careful building was enough. Winter did not leave all at once. It loosened slowly, reluctantly, as if testing whether the land and the people living on it were ready to manage without its constant pressure. The snow around Caleb Rowe's cabin began to recede in uneven patches, exposing dark soil and flattened grass beneath. The forest smelled different now. Damp bark, cold earth, a faint sharpness that suggested movement rather than stillness. Caleb noticed the change first in the dogs. Ash had grown sturdier in a matter of days. His movements were no longer tentative. He carried himself with a natural confidence, chest forward, head high, tail held in an easy curve rather than tight excitement. His coat had lost its dull, frost-worn look and darkened into a clean black and white sheen. Though still young, perhaps 8 weeks now, there was something deliberate in how he observed the world. He watched before he acted. When he did act, it was with purpose. Ember changed more quietly. She filled out slowly, her ribs less visible, her steps steadier. Her pale eyes, soft gray with hints of gold, missed very little. She did not rush toward new things. She assessed them. Where Ash leaned forward, Ember leaned inward. Where Ash tested boundaries, Ember memorized them. Caleb began to understand that her caution was not weakness, but awareness. Each morning, Caleb walked them farther from the cabin. Short distances at first, then longer paths along the tree line. He kept the leash loose, allowing them to learn without forcing direction. Ash pulled ahead, eager but responsive when Caleb called him back. Ember stayed close, often brushing against Caleb's leg as they walked, as if checking in. "You're not lost," Caleb said to her once, half amused. "I'm right here." She flicked an ear, as if she understood. One afternoon, as clouds rolled low over the valley, Caleb decided to take them to the old trail that cut toward the river. It was a familiar route, one he had walked countless times alone. The path was narrow and uneven, bordered by pine and fir. Snow lingered in the shadows, slick but manageable. They had gone no more than half a mile when Ash stopped abruptly. His body stiffened, nose lifted, ears forward. Ember froze a second later, pressing closer to Caleb's leg. Caleb followed Ash's gaze and saw movement ahead. A man stood just off the trail, bent slightly at the waist, examining something near the ground. He straightened as Caleb approached. He was tall, lean, and broad across the shoulders, wearing a worn brown jacket and jeans faded from years of use. His hair was dark with silver at the temples, his beard thick but neatly trimmed, outlining a face marked by sharp cheekbones and a prominent nose. His eyes were dark and alert, though there was a guardedness to them, a distance that suggested experience rather than suspicion. "Didn't expect company out here," the man said. "Neither did I," Caleb replied, keeping his tone neutral. The man's gaze dropped to the dogs. "Yours?" "For now." He nodded. "Name's Lucas Hart." He extended a hand, firm grip, steady pressure. "I track for fish and wildlife, mostly wolves and elk." Caleb shook his hand. "Caleb Rowe." Recognition flickered briefly across Lucas's face. "Smoke jumper?" "Former." Lucas studied him a moment longer, then looked back at the dogs. "They're young. Border collies?" "Yes." Lucas crouched slowly, careful not to spook them. Ash stepped forward, curious but alert. Ember stayed back, watching intently. "Smart pair," Lucas said. "Different temperaments." "That obvious?" Caleb asked. Lucas smiled faintly. "If you spend enough time watching animals, patterns show themselves." His expression sobered. "You're lucky they survived this winter." "A lot don't," Caleb nodded. "They weren't supposed to." Lucas stood, brushing dirt from his hands. "Neither were some of us," he said quietly, then seemed to reconsider the openness of the remark. "Anyway, I'll let you get on." As he turned to leave, Ash barked once, sharp, questioning. Lucas paused, glanced back, then continued down the trail, his figure blending easily into the forest. The walk back was quieter. Ash stayed closer than before. Ember's steps were deliberate, as if the encounter had left an impression. That evening, the wind returned, rising steadily after dusk. Clouds swallowed the moon, and the forest darkened early. Caleb secured the cabin, checked the fire, and fed the dogs. They ate side by side now without hesitation, comfortable in each other's presence. As the wind rattled the windows, Caleb found himself restless. He pulled on his jacket and stepped onto the porch, the cold air grounding him. The sky hung low and heavy. He thought of the words Lucas had spoken. "You're lucky they survived." The truth of it pressed against his chest. Inside, Ash and Ember slept curled together, their bodies forming a seamless shape. Watching them, Caleb felt a familiar tightening behind his ribs. The same pressure he used to feel before deployments. Anticipation mixed with responsibility. Later that night, a sound cut through the wind, a sharp bark. Caleb was on his feet instantly, heart quickening. He grabbed a flashlight and opened the door. Ash stood at the edge of the porch, body tense, ears forward. Ember hovered just behind him. "What is it?" Caleb asked softly. The beam of light swept across the yard and caught movement near the tree line. A deer, thin and skittish, lingered at the edge of the visibility, its ribs showing beneath its coat. It froze in the light, then bolted deeper into the forest. Ash barked again, this time with urgency rather than alarm. Ember let out a soft whine, unsettled. Caleb crouched, resting a hand on Ash's back. "Easy, you did right." He realized then what had changed. The dogs were no longer simply surviving. They were responding to sound, to threat, to him. The wind died down near dawn. When light returned, it revealed a world washed clean by cold rain that had followed the snow. Caleb made coffee and sat at the table, notebook open but empty. He stared at the page, then began to write. Day 12. Walked the river trail, met a tracker, dogs alert, protective, starting to trust their instincts, starting to trust mine again. He closed the notebook and leaned back, listening to the quiet sounds of the cabin, waking. Ash stretched, yawning widely. Ember blinked up at him, then rested her chin on his boot. Caleb looked down at her, then at Ash, who sat expectantly nearby. "Looks like we're doing this," he said quietly. The words did not feel heavy. They felt honest. Outside, winter continued its slow retreat. Inside, something steadier had taken its place. Spring made its presence known not through warmth, but through sound. Snowmelt ran in thin, restless streams across the ground, carving temporary paths through dirt and stone. The forest no longer held its breath. Branches creaked as they shifted, birds returned in cautious numbers, and the river beyond the trees spoke louder each day. With the changing season came movement, and with movement came memory. Caleb Rowe felt it in his body before he understood it in his mind. His sleep grew lighter. Dreams, once rare and distant, returned in fragments. Not full scenes, but sensations. Heat, wind, the smell of smoke that clung to clothing no matter how many times it was washed. He woke before dawn more often now, sitting up in the narrow bed, listening to the quiet cabin and the steady breathing of Ash and Ember nearby. The dogs noticed the change immediately. Ash became more watchful indoors, positioning himself between Caleb and the door without instruction. He followed Caleb from room to room, his movements smooth and deliberate. Ember responded differently. She stayed close at night, curling against the leg of the chair where Caleb sat, her small body a steady point of warmth. When Caleb stirred too quickly, she lifted her head and watched him, eyes calm but intent, as if reminding him where he was. One morning, as a light rain replaced snow, Caleb decided routine alone would no longer be enough. He loaded the dogs into the truck and drove into Missoula proper, farther than they had gone before. The streets were wet and gray, storefronts just beginning to open. He parked near the old fire station at the edge of town. Ash tensed the moment they stepped out of the truck. The building stood quiet now, its red paint faded, doors closed. The station had been decommissioned years earlier, replaced by a newer facility closer to the highway. But for Caleb, it was not empty. It was full of ghosts. A man stepped out from the side of the building, carrying a cardboard box. He was tall and solidly built, in his late 40s, with close-cropped hair and a beard peppered heavily with gray. His face was square and weathered, marked by lines that suggested both laughter and strain. He wore a dark jacket with a faded department emblem on the sleeve. "Caleb," the man said, surprise flickering across his features. Caleb stopped. "Tom Reyes," he replied. Tom had been a station captain once. Not on Caleb's final crew, but close enough to know the names, the losses, the details no one else remembered. He had a reputation for steadiness, for putting himself between danger and younger firefighters whenever possible. Years after a warehouse collapse left him with a permanent limp, he still showed up to mentor new recruits. "I heard you were back in the area," Tom said. His gaze dropped briefly to the dogs. "Didn't expect to see you here. Didn't expect to be," Caleb answered honestly. Ash watched Tom closely, head slightly lowered, ears forward. Ember stayed near Caleb's leg, alert but calm. Tom noticed. "They're protective." "They've earned it," Caleb said. They stood in silence for a moment, rain tapping lightly against pavement. Tom cleared his throat. "You doing all right?" Caleb considered the question carefully. "I'm managing." Tom nodded. "That's more than most." He hesitated, then added, "There's a memorial next week for the Canyon Fire. 10 years. Caleb's jaw tightened. "I didn't know." "We didn't put it out wide," Tom said gently. "Didn't want to force it on anyone." Caleb glanced at the station doors, then back at the dogs. Ash shifted his weight, sensing the tension. Ember pressed briefly against Caleb's leg. "I'll think about it," Caleb said. "That's all," Tom replied. He gave a short nod, then turned and walked away, the slight hitch in his step more noticeable as he went. The drive back to the cabin was quiet. Ash lay alert in the back seat, watching the road through the window. Ember rested her head on the seat edge, eyes half closed but attentive. Caleb kept his hands steady on the wheel, though his thoughts pulled backward, tugged by names and images he rarely allowed himself to revisit. At the cabin, the rain intensified, drumming against the roof. Caleb unloaded the dogs and moved inside. The familiar space grounded him, but the weight in his chest remained. That afternoon, Evelyn Parker arrived unexpectedly. She took one look at Caleb and set her basket down without comment. "You ran into something?" she said. Caleb did not ask how she knew. "Someone from my old life," she nodded. "Those always arrive uninvited." They sat near the fire as rain streaked the windows. Ash lay stretched out between them, Ember curled close to Caleb's foot. "I was invited to a memorial," Caleb said finally. "For my crew." Evelyn waited. "I don't know if I should go." "Why?" she asked simply. Caleb stared into the fire. "Because I survived." Evelyn leaned forward slightly. "So did I," she said. "Different reasons, same weight." Caleb looked at her then, really looked, and saw something he had not before. Not just age or kindness, but endurance. Loss carried quietly. "You don't honor the dead by disappearing," Evelyn continued. "You honor them by staying." That night, the rain gave way to wind. Branches knocked softly against the cabin, and the forest shifted restlessly. Caleb lay awake, listening. Ash rose once, pacing briefly before settling again. Ember moved closer, her small body pressing against Caleb's side. Caleb closed his eyes and breathed, grounding himself in the present. The dog's warmth, the sound of weather, the certainty of now. In the morning, the storm had passed. The air was sharp and clean. Caleb stood on the porch with a mug of coffee, watching the clouds thin. Ash and Ember sat beside him, facing outward, alert and calm. "I'm going," Caleb said quietly, "to the memorial." Ash's tail wagged once. Ember blinked, then leaned against his leg. The decision did not erase the past. It did not promise peace. But it felt like movement, and movement, Caleb had learned, was the opposite of being trapped. The morning of the memorial arrived clear and cold, the kind of spring day that carried winter in its bones, but promised warmth later. Caleb Rowe woke before the alarm he had set, the habit ingrained, though he no longer needed it. Ash was already awake, sitting near the door with composed alertness, while Ember lay stretched beside the hearth, eyes open, watching Caleb without moving. They sensed the difference in the air. Not danger, but weight. Caleb dressed slowly, choosing clothes that were clean but unremarkable. He shaved carefully, the scrape of the blade familiar and grounding, then paused to look at himself in the mirror. The man staring back looked older than 41, his face leaner, lines deeper around the eyes. But there was steadiness there, too, something that had been missing when he first arrived in the valley. He knelt and rested a hand on each dog's head. "You'll be fine," he said quietly. "I'll be back." Ash's tail thumped once. Ember pressed her, nose briefly into Caleb's palm. The drive into town was quiet. Traffic was light, the streets washed clean by yesterday's rain. The memorial was held at the edge of the old canyon overlook, a place chosen not for comfort, but for truth. The land fell away sharply there, opening to a vast stretch of forest and rock. A wooden railing marked the boundary, weathered and scarred by years of wind. Caleb parked and stepped out. People stood in small clusters, voices low. He recognized some faces immediately. Others had aged into unfamiliar versions of themselves. Near the railing stood Marianne Holt, a woman in her early 50s, with dark hair cut short and streaked with gray at the temples. She wore a simple black coat and stood with her hands folded tightly in front of her. Her posture was rigid, her expression composed but brittle. Marianne had been married to one of the men lost in the canyon fire. Grief had shaped her into someone reserved, precise, careful with emotion. When she saw Caleb, her eyes widened slightly. A few steps away was Ethan Brooks, younger than most of the others, late 30s perhaps, with a narrow face and a beard he had grown too quickly after the fire. He had been a rookie then, injured but alive, the last to be pulled from the edge. He stood with his shoulders hunched, hands jammed into his jacket pockets, gaze fixed on the ground as if expecting it to give way. Caleb felt the familiar tightening in his chest as he approached. Tom Reyes stood near the center of the group, leaning slightly on a cane he did not always need, but used when standing too long. He caught Caleb's eye and gave a small nod. No words, just acknowledgement. The ceremony was brief, no speeches designed to inspire, no attempts to explain what could not be explained. Names were read aloud, one by one, each followed by a pause that allowed the sound to settle into the open air. The wind carried the names outward, scattering them across the canyon. When it was over, people lingered, Some spoke quietly, others stood apart, absorbing the place in their own way. Marianne approached Caleb. Up close, the lines around her eyes were more visible, etched by years of restraint. "I wasn't sure you'd come," she said. "I wasn't either," Caleb replied. She nodded, accepting that. "He talked about you," she added, referring to her husband. "Said you were careful, that you watched the wind." Caleb swallowed. "I should have watched harder." Marianne held his gaze steadily. "You didn't cause the fire," she said, "and you didn't survive by stealing anything from the rest of them." Her voice softened. "I spent years thinking survival meant guilt. It doesn't. It means responsibility." She stepped back, leaving Caleb with the words. Ethan Brooks hovered nearby, shifting his weight. Finally, he spoke. "I wanted to say thank you." Caleb turned to him. Ethan's eyes were red-rimmed, his beard hiding the tension in his jaw. "For what?" Caleb asked. "For not leaving," Ethan said. "You stayed long enough to pull me back. I never said it." Caleb nodded once. "You stayed alive," he replied. "That was the job." Ethan managed a thin smile. "I'm trying to live like it matters now." "That's enough," Caleb said quietly. As the crowd thinned, Caleb remained at the railing. He rested his hands on the wood and looked out over the canyon. The land was green now, softened by new growth, but the shape of the place had not changed. He felt the past press close, then ease. A presence settled beside him. He turned to find Lucas Hart standing there, hands in his jacket pockets. His beard was damp from the morning air, his expression subdued. "Didn't expect to see you here," Caleb said. Lucas shrugged. "I worked that fire's perimeter back then. Different angle, same outcome." They stood in silence for a moment. "You coming back to the cabin after this?" Lucas asked. "Yes," Lucas nodded. "Good. The dogs, Ash and Ember, right? They're lucky, but you already know that." He paused, then added, "So are you." Lucas left without ceremony, blending into the departing crowd. Caleb returned to his truck and sat for a moment before starting the engine. He felt tired, but not hollow. The weight he had carried felt redistributed, shared with the land, the people, the names spoken aloud. Back at the cabin, Ash barked sharply the moment the truck appeared. Ember followed more quietly, both dogs pressing close when Caleb opened the door. He knelt and let them crowd him, hands resting against their warm fur. "I'm back," he said. The afternoon passed gently. Caleb cooked, ate, and moved through the familiar space with a steadiness that felt earned. Later, as dusk settled, he took the dogs outside. The sky flared briefly with color before dimming. Ash stood alert at the edge of the yard, scanning the trees. Ember sat near Caleb's leg, content to observe. Caleb looked out across the forests and felt the absence he had always feared. It was still there, but it no longer defined the space around it. He knelt beside the dogs. "We keep going," he said quietly. "That's how we honor it." Ash's tail wagged once. Ember leaned against him. The names spoken at the canyon did not fade. They remained, carried forward, not as anchors but as markers. And for the first time, Caleb allowed himself to move on without leaving them behind. Spring did not arrive with celebration. It arrived through work. The ground softened first, then the air. Snow retreated into the shadows beneath trees, leaving behind mud and exposed roots that demanded attention with every step. The river ran louder now, swollen with meltwater, its current quick and insistent. The forest, once quiet under winter's weight, resumed its restless motion. Nothing waited anymore. Caleb Rowe found that the days after the memorial felt different. Not lighter, exactly, but clearer. The past no longer pressed forward without warning. It remained present, but contained, like a map he could now unfold without losing his bearings. Ash and Ember felt the shift as well. Ash had grown into his body quickly. At nearly 3 months old, he moved with confident coordination, his legs strong, his chest broader than before. His coat gleamed in the daylight, the black rich and clean, the white markings sharp against it. He carried himself like a dog aware of his purpose, alert but controlled. When Caleb worked outside, Ash stayed nearby, watching the tree line and the path with quiet vigilance. Ember developed in subtler ways. She remained smaller, her frame light, but her movements had gained certainty. She no longer hesitated before following Ash or Caleb. Instead, she chose her moments carefully, stepping forward with deliberate intent. Her eyes, pale and thoughtful, reflected the world back rather than challenging it. She stayed close when it mattered, and ranged farther when she felt secure. Caleb began to put his hands back to use. The cabin needed attention. Winter had left its marks in loosened boards and a section of porch railing weakened by ice. Caleb spent his mornings repairing what had endured too much neglect. He replaced planks, reinforced joints, worked methodically without rushing. Ash followed each movement closely, settling nearby when Caleb stopped. Ember often lay just inside the open doorway, half in shadow, half in sun, watching both man and forest. One afternoon, while Caleb was repairing the fence line along the property's edge, a truck pulled up slowly on the dirt road. He straightened and rested a hand on the post, assessing before reacting. Ash lifted his head immediately. Ember stood, alert but calm. The driver stepped out and closed the door carefully. He was in his mid-30s, average height, lean build, with sun-darkened skin and a narrow face. His hair was cropped short, and a neatly trimmed beard framed a mouth set more often in concentration than ease. He wore work boots, worn jeans, and a jacket bearing the emblem of the Missoula Conservation Corps. "Afternoon," the man called. His voice was steady, practiced. "Name's Daniel Ortiz." Caleb nodded. "Caleb." Daniel approached slowly, respectful of the dogs. "I'm checking in with landowners along the river. We're mapping erosion risks from the melt." He gestured toward the trees. "You've got a vulnerable section, near the lower bank." Caleb followed his gaze. He had noticed the change himself. "I know," he said. "I've been watching it." Daniel smiled slightly. "Most people don't. They wait until the ground's already gone." He crouched briefly, letting Ash sniff his hand. "Good dogs." "They're learning," Caleb replied. Daniel straightened. "I lost my brother in a flash flood up north," he said. Not as a confession, but as context. "I don't miss signs anymore." Caleb regarded him for a moment, then nodded. "Neither do I." They walked the boundary together, discussing runoff and reinforcement options. Daniel offered materials and labor support through the Corps, noting that volunteers would be available within the week. As Daniel prepared to leave, he paused. "You're building something solid here," he said. "That matters more than people realize." When the truck disappeared down the road, Caleb returned to work with renewed focus. The future was no longer abstract. It had shape, tasks, responsibility. That evening, Evelyn Parker arrived with her usual quiet presence. She watched Caleb finish securing a post, then surveyed the progress. "You've been busy," she said. "Feels right," Caleb answered. They sat together on the porch as the sun dipped low. Ash lay at their feet, Ember curled against Caleb's leg. Evelyn studied him carefully. "You're not running anymore," she observed. Caleb considered the statement. "No," he said. "I don't think I am." The following days passed in steady motion. Volunteers arrived to help reinforce the riverbank. Caleb worked alongside them, directing where needed, but never taking more space than necessary. Ash remained close, responding to Caleb's cues instinctively. Ember stayed near the work, but not in it, observing from a safe distance, stepping forward only when called. On the final afternoon of the repairs, a sudden shift in weather brought dark clouds and sharp wind. Tools were gathered quickly. As the first heavy drops fell, Ash barked once, alerting the group. Ember moved immediately to Caleb's side. The storm passed as quickly as it arrived, leaving the ground soaked but intact. The work held. That night, Caleb sat at the table with his notebook open. Day 29, cabin secure, bank reinforced, dogs steady, I'm steady. He closed the book and leaned back, listening to the quiet. Later, as darkness settled, Caleb stepped outside with the dogs. The sky was clear, stars sharp and numerous. Ash stood at attention, scanning the darkness beyond the yard. Ember sat beside Caleb, her shoulder pressed lightly against his leg. Caleb looked out at the land he had nearly abandoned, and now chose daily. "I'm staying," he said aloud. The words did not echo. They settled. Ash turned toward him, tail wagging once. Ember leaned in closer. The choice no longer felt like a decision. It felt like home. Sometimes miracles don't arrive with thunder or blazing light. They come quietly, on cold nights, through small hands, gentle hearts, and lives the world almost forgot. God often works in ways we don't recognize at first, through compassion instead of strength, through presence instead of answers, through love that refuses to walk away. In saving those two small lives, one broken man found his way back to hope, not because the past disappeared, but because God reminded him that love still had work for him to do. And maybe that's the miracle meant for all of us, that even in our ordinary days, when we choose kindness, when we protect the vulnerable, when we stay instead of leaving, God is quietly at work, turning pain into purpose. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. And if you believe no one, no child, no animal, no soul should ever face fear alone, please subscribe to the channel and help us spread stories that heal. May God bless you, protect you, and remind you, you are never forgotten, and you are never alone.